But once the sun does break out across central and eastern areas of England, there's a further risk of some heavy downpours. Further travel disruption is expected through Thursday. Not everywhere will see these thunderstorms, but where you do see them, they could bring some fairly major impacts. It's going to be another humid day, temperatures in the mid to high 20s once again. On Friday, it looks fairly dry to start the day. There's a risk of some further downpours across eastern areas into the afternoon. But looking further west, there is a change on the way. A weather front wrapped around an area of low pressure will bring fresher, wetter and windier weather as we head into the weekend. So showery weather, particularly across northwestern areas, a little bit drier and brighter across the south and east.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Celebrate a spectacular summer with your chance to win an incredible £30,000 in tax-free cash in our Great British Giveaway. It's the biggest prize of the year so far, and it's totally tax-free. What would you spend that on? Luxury holidays, a new car, or just put it away for a rainy day? Whatever you do with £30,000 in tax-free cash, make sure you don't miss out on the chance to make it yours. For another chance to win £30,000 in tax-free cash, text cash to 63232. Text costs £2 plus one standard network rate message. You can enter online at gbnews.com/win. Entries cost £2. Or post your name and number to GB07 PO Box 8690 Derby DE1 9TT. UK only. Entrance must be 18 or over. Lines close at 5 p.m. on the 30th of August. Please check the closing time if listening or watching on demand. Good luck.
Hi there, I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm going to take a second to tell you all about my show, Dubes & Co. We start off with the issues of the day. We then bring in both sides of the arguments. We get rid of the disrespect. And then you throw me into the mix. And trust me, I'll tell it exactly how it is. And then, of course, the magic ingredient, you at home. We mix it all together and what have we got? In my opinion, the best debate show in town. Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel. Good afternoon, Britain.
Your lunchtime update on the stories that matter across the UK.
From breaking news and insightful analysis, inspiring stories and lively debates. You're comparing yourself to a former Prime Minister.
Which is it?
Stay informed, stay updated, stay entertained.
I just don't know how anyone would not want to be there.
Every weekday from midday.
We are Good Afternoon Britain, only on GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Tune in to Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. GB News royalty with your perfect start to the weekend. Lucky us. Feisty and fearless guests.
Well, I'm a normal person, so ask me.
Honest opinions that raises more questions than a Gary Barlow tax return. And a few surprises along the way. Might be cold in this studio. That is Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. 8 to 9 only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Are the newspapers getting you down?
My wife didn't divorce me that month.
Struggling to separate the wheat from the chaff?
I know that it's a bit of a circus at the best of times.
Well, don't worry. Headliners has got you covered. We'll take the burden of reading the day's news, and if we get depressed, who cares? It's an occupational hazard, frankly. That's Headliners on GB News from 11 p.m. till midnight, and the following morning, 5 till 6 a.m. on GB News, the comedy channel. Nah, just kidding. Britain's news channel.
Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation. Tonight, with the breakdown of law and order across the United Kingdom, we will be revealing a Metropolitan Police recruitment campaign that shows why police forces are losing their way and why we need a return to proper policing. Huw Edwards, once the star of the BBC, has pleaded guilty to making indecent images of children. We'll be discussing why the liberal media elite were so keen to exonerate him and attack the Sun newspaper for reporting on his misbehaviour. Could Labour be about to cause energy bills to rise again amidst a drive towards green energy? Plus, the hidden annual cost of employee illness has reached £30 billion since 2018, while Britain is facing a productivity crisis. I'll be joined by a man with a plan for Britain's economy. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by my fearsomely feisty panel, historian and broadcaster Tessa Dunlop, and the associate common editor at The Telegraph, Mutaz Ahmed. As ever, I want to hear from you. Let me know your views, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now, it's your favourite part of the evening, the News Bulletin with Polly Middlehurst.
Well, let's bring you the very latest news from the GB newsroom, and we can tell you that tonight in London, protesters have thrown flares at Downing Street. Beer cans have been thrown, glass bottles as well, all at the gates of Downing Street during a protest in the wake of the Southport knife attack and riot. Let's take you live to the scenes in Whitehall, where we've seen police in riot gear blocking the streets. Crowds have been heard chanting, "Save our kids," "Stop the boats" in central London, and we've also seen protesters attempt to kick down fences. The Metropolitan Police have placed strict conditions on this protest. It's called the Enough is Enough protest, instructing the demonstration must end in just under half an hour's time. Superintendent Neil Hollyoake leading the police operation tonight for the Metropolitan Police, going online earlier on today, urging everyone to exercise their right to protest calmly and within the law, adding that any disorder will be dealt with swiftly. But in footage from the scene, we have, as I said, heard protesters chanting, "Save our kids." Even at one point, "Rule Britannia," and flares and objects have been thrown towards the gates of Downing Street. These live pictures coming to us from central London. We'll keep an eye on what's going on down there throughout the rest of this evening. Well, of course, those scenes in reaction to what happened in Southport, where police say they're also aware of plans for further rioting tonight there after Monday's stabbing spree at a dance school which ended the lives of 3 little girls. Disorder broke out yesterday outside a mosque following speculation about the 17-year-old suspect who remains in police custody. Officers have today been given more time to question him, and today, it must be said, much of that community came together outside that mosque and swept up and rebuilt walls and tried to calm tensions there. We'll be keeping an eye on events in Southport as well tonight. Well, also in the news today, the BBC has admitted they knew about the arrest of the former newsreader Huw Edwards 5 months before he resigned in April. But the corporation said it would have sacked him if he'd been charged while being a member of staff. Earlier, the Metropolitan Police confirmed that the man who sent Huw Edwards indecent images of children being abused was a convicted paedophile. Mr. Edwards had 41 of the most serious type of photographs in his WhatsApp messaging, including one of a child as young as 7 years old. Let's turn our attentions now to news from the Middle East, where there are significant developments there as well. The Foreign and Defence Secretaries have headed out as Benjamin Netanyahu vowed tonight to continue Israel's war against Hamas, the Israeli Prime Minister praising his military for its strike on the Lebanese capital, Beirut, which took out a senior Hezbollah commander. Meanwhile, Iran's promised harsh punishment for the assassination of a separate leader of Hamas, this time on its soil. Ismail Haniyeh died in a strike on the Iranian capital, which the terror group is blaming on Israel, though the government of Israel hasn't yet commented on that. Some better news coming to us from the Olympics in Paris. Team GB have landed 2 more golds at the Games, both coming as well in dramatic fashion. Alex Yee snatching victory in the closing stages of the men's triathlon, whilst the women's quadruple sculls rowers pipped the Netherlands right to the post to secure their gold at the last second. And that sensational comeback puts Britain 4th in the medal table. That's it. I'm back in an hour.
Conundrum facing society. Crime figures, excluding online fraud, show crime is falling. Yet televisions, as you've just seen, show that Britain is quite literally aflame, even outside Downing Street. The crimes of individual criminals seem to be less frequent, but the disorder of groups more common. And this has taken us back to an older, more dangerous world where gangs control the streets and armed bands possess certain parts of the country. It would be familiar to a time traveller from the Middle Ages or even from the 18th century England, but it has not been true in modern times in this country. So you may be less likely to be burgled, but city centre tumults becoming weekly, sometimes it seems even daily events. From Hare Hills to Southport to Southend to Manchester to Kent. I'm not exaggerating when I say Britain is aflame. Crime of a particular evil is unravelling across the country. It's crime with no particular community, no cause, just a general sense of disorder and a loss of control, a loss of that pea-light understanding that we are the police and the police are us. And at times like this, one can only hope that the police are doing what they were set up to do, to deter crime. But no, a new Metropolitan Police recruitment campaign seen on the Tube shows a force that has lost its sense of purpose. The advert reads, "You've stopped someone carrying a large amount of drugs. He's just a teenager. He's exhausted and scared. He's broken the law, but maybe he really needs your help. So how do you get him talking?" This is social worker-style policing. It turns criminals into victims. It poses crime as a mental health problem caused by external factors, removing the consequence of free will from those who victimise others and commit crime. This is a top-down phenomenon. It's not a rogue recruitment campaign, but the belief genuinely held by our elite that the solution to crime is to be nicer to criminals. The commentariat genuinely believes we should have Norwegian-style holiday camp prisons and that significant numbers of prisoners shouldn't be behind bars. You may recall Mothin Ali, the Green Party councillor in Leeds, who let out this deranged battle cry upon his election earlier this year.
Raise the voice of Palestine! Allahu Akbar!
But in fairness to Mr. Ali, he was seen at the riots trying to calm them down. However, when addressing a camera later on, his response spoke volumes.
Community has been let down for so long, whether it's by the local government, whether it's by the national government, whether it's by the local authorities. Our community has been badly let down, our community has been badly neglected, we've suffered massively from underinvestment.
Fires go on behind him, and that's the fault of the community for letting people down. No scorn for those responsible, no emphasis on the thugs who perpetrated the riot. No, Mr. Ali would have you believe that a convoy of ping-pong and snooker tables would have solved this clearly deep-rooted problem. We've seen the horrendous scenes in Southport unfolding in the past few days, but it was only a few years ago that the then retiring head of Merseyside Police said cutting poverty and inequality is the best way to reduce crime. He said if he were given £5 billion to cut crime, he would spend £1 billion on law enforcement and £4 billion on tackling poverty. We spend £266 billion on welfare in this country, so there's no shortage of money to tackle poverty. Crime is now seen not as something to be dealt with by arresting criminals, but a sociological problem that ought to be studied, prodded at and pontificated about. We're told it's caused by poverty, which is an insult to those who are in poverty but don't commit crime. Indeed, it's for those people who live in poverty whose interests are best served by stopping crime. Nowadays, whenever great crime is committed, the platitudes are rolled out. We will not be divided. There is no place for this in our community. Even don't look back in anger. Well, I'm afraid we are divided. There evidently is a place for these crimes in our community, and people look back in frustration and anger because they want it to be stopped, and they want the establishment to stop applying nonsense Marxist theories to this breakdown of control and to do what is right, and remember that the basic, the fundamental, the principal job of the state is defence of the realm and good order at home. As ever, let me know your views, mailmog@gbnews.com. I'm joined now by James Treadwell, Professor of Criminology at Staffordshire University. James, thank you so much for joining me. Officially, crime, other than online crime, is falling in the figures, and yet we're seeing this nightly diet of disorder. What, in your view, as a Professor of Criminology, is going on?
I think a lot of what's happening, actually, is to do with crime changing and people not keeping up. Some forms of acquisitive crime, those that we associate with the 1980s, burglary, car theft, they go through phases and changes, but by and large, those crimes are not the volume nowadays. The vast volume of crime is being committed on the internet, a lot is being committed against businesses, and an awful lot of crime is simply not being recorded. And I think when we talk about crime, we do need to think about what our core priorities should be. Now, one of those, and I think you rightly highlighted it, is the scenes of violence on our streets. If we're to prevent anything the public want, they They want to feel safe, and violent disorder fundamentally undermines that. But another aspect of crime, and it's interesting, you know, that we're having this conversation today, is if we think about, for example, the estimations put on offences like child sexual exploitation that's going on online, the sharing of indecent imagery, for example. It's largely that we detect and discover what is the tip of the iceberg, and there are hundreds of thousands of offences that occur that will never come to light. And the Pelian principles that you talked about, you know, prevention being better than cure in some ways, I think one of the problems is in some aspects of crime, we've almost lost the possibility of prevention now. But that's created almost a situation where many have offended almost with impunity in some categories of crime. And public confidence has massively fallen.
Yes, and it's this feeling in the disorder in the streets that the police aren't part of the community, and whether this is the far-right protesters, the Palestinian protesters, feeling that the police are the opposition, whereas we've always previously felt that the police are part of us, they're part of the community. And I wonder how you overcome that, because the police have certainly been trying in diversity and outreach efforts to make themselves look like society at large.
Absolutely. And I think the police are in a really, really difficult position in many ways. One of the other Pelian principles, and I think it's one that's worth returning to, along with the police being the public and the public being the police, is that of political impartiality for the police, that in effect what the police should do is fundamentally, without fear or favour, they should enforce the law as is written. You know, there shouldn't be any differentiation in treatment. They should follow the law, and the law should be their guide. And by doing that, and by placing offenders before the judiciary, who then make the decision, the police maintain the confidence of the public. Now, of course, the difficulty with that is we've seen the police pulled more and more into political positioning very often, where they're having to choose or seemingly take sides, and I think that can undermine some of the public confidence in policing, and it's a difficult issue. Another thing that we need to be mindful of, I think, is, you know, the police are working in such a way that where they're trying to place people in front of the courts, but they're operating in a criminal justice system that quite often constrains them. So, you know, they're having to.
Well, I think, have we lost James? Unfortunately, James, thank you very much. But now over to Rakib Ihsan, a commentator and researcher in politics and governance. Rakib, how would you describe the problem, and what solutions do you think there are to making this a country where people can walk the streets safely without thinking they're going to be caught up in the middle of a riot?
Well, we face some very serious challenges, Sir Jacob, when it comes to law and order. I think one of the big problems we have is that there's been the disintegration of neighbourhood policing. You've talked a great deal there about the police being seen as part of the local community. At the moment, in many communities, the dynamic is one of confrontation and adversity, and that needs to be reversed, and that's not going to be easy at all. There needs to be a restoration of neighbourhood policing, where you have effective local neighbourhood policing teams. They're able to gather on-the-ground knowledge of local criminal activity, antisocial behaviour, by engaging in good faith with residents, local civic associations, small to medium-sized businesses. Unfortunately, that model has broken down in many parts of the country. So what we've actually witnessed is the de facto decriminalisation of certain crimes. So I think that one of the main issues here is that there may be a growing number of people who entertain those thoughts of lawlessness, who believe that they may well get away with committing those crimes because they feel that policing is not as robust as it used to be, or the chances of being caught or being held to account are not as high as they were before.
And this is very important, isn't it? Because we've discussed on this programme shoplifting and the feeling that shoplifting has become a non-crime. But once people feel they can get away with shoplifting, or people think that other people are able to get away with shoplifting, then they don't worry about committing other crimes, and it creates a contempt for the law and order system.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I think that what you don't want, which I think is increasingly being the case, you have law-abiding citizens who are losing faith in the police, that public confidence in police forces across the country is on a consistently downward trajectory. And I think that really feeds into some of the disorders that we've seen in various parts of the country, where I think that there's just a very clear disregard for the policing authority. And I think that is a very serious problem. And I don't think that it's going to get better anytime soon.
And the very important point that James made, I don't know if you heard the earlier interview, when he was saying that people feel that the police some things differently, so that if you look at the Sarah Everard protests, they seem to be policed in a very heavy-handed manner, whereas the Black Lives Matters protests were going on at the same point. A policeman was taking the knee, and it seemed if they liked your protest, you could get away with it. If they didn't like your protest, then you couldn't. And that's very bad for policing because of the way it undermines confidence.
Oh, no, absolutely. It undermines that principle of neutrality, which should be at the heart of policing in the UK. And I think that what that demonstrates is that there's a degree of ideological selectivity in terms of how police forces manage and approach particular protests. And I think that since we're talking about recent public disorders, I think even the language and the tone which is struck by members of the government, including the Home Secretary, when it comes to, for example, the recent riots in Southport, you can see that Yvette Cooper's language was very strong. She was very robust in terms of labeling those involved as thugs, and rightly so. But then if you saw her language in terms of the Hare Hills riots in Leeds, it was more of a conciliatory tone. It certainly was less assertive in nature, even though we had police officers attacked, police cars were flipped, and I think a double-decker bus was set ablaze. These are also forms of thuggery. So I think that members of government, they should try to be as consistent as possible when it comes to condemning various kinds of public disorder.
And there's a need for the police to understand what they're doing. I started with this extraordinary advert that's appeared on the Tube about a police officer who finds somebody with drugs, and seeing how they can understand the problem. Actually, the job of the police is to recognise it's a crime. They're not going to arrest or charge every crime that they ever come across. They will deal with it using their discretion. But the starting point is that it's a crime, not that they need to feel sympathy for the criminal.
No, that's absolutely right. Their job at the end of the day is to combat criminal activity. Whether they think that, or generally, that this crime is treated too robustly by the criminal justice system, should this really be a criminal offence? That's not their job to make that judgment. Ultimately, their job is to combat criminal activity, and if people are participating in criminal activities, that they're held to account and that they're arrested.
Thank you so much, Rakib. In a moment, amidst Huw Edwards pleading guilty to making indecent images of children, we'll discuss the liberal media elites who tried to blame this on the right-wing press, particularly the Sun newspaper.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Tom, dying to talk to you about this. Transport for London, right? They run the buses and tubes and things in London, and they've got £2.5 million quid. £2.5 million quid, which they're going to spend on what?
Diversity training. I dare say they've probably got plenty of it already.
But let me tell you something. I sit on a board of a company, and I was diversity trained recently.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, really?
And I must admit,
What was that like?
Well, I thought it was like stating the bleeding obvious, right? So you sit there and you say, well, why would I do that? Or why would I treat someone like that? I wouldn't do that in the first place. I don't need to be trained in this. And you just sat there for 6 hours while people told you the obvious. But what do you think of spending that amount of money for Transport for London?
It's crazy, because on the one hand, do we need this diversity training? The TfL is an incredibly diverse workforce already. The idea that there are barriers to entry there doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Also, as you say, these things are commonsensical, really. And to the point, sometimes they can become problematic, because they're not just saying, you know, be open and tolerant of people and so on. It's actually preaching a more kind of divisive sort of rhetoric to people, which can be a big problem in the
get your
workplace.
diversity training from your boss or somebody, don't you? Somebody pulls you up and says, you don't talk to people like that. This is how you talk to them. That's it. Done.
It should be that
spend
simple.
6 hours in front of
And I know that in the grand scheme of things, £2.5 million is kind of money down the back of the sofa. But at the same time, my local tube station just closes early on random nights of the week because of the fact that they haven't got enough staff.
4 years ago, there were 655 people at City Hall earning over £100,000 a year. People might argue that's 655 too many. There are 1,100 now. 4 years later.
1,100.
Actually, 1,142 to be precise.
The People's Channel.
Join me, Nana Okwir, for an informative, interactive news programme with a difference. It's fun.
It's true. You're not wrong. No one will be cancelled. Lovely.
Join me from 3 p.m. every weekend, only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every Saturday, 10 till 12, we'll bring you all of the news that you need to know. We'll also remind you that there is so much to smile about.
It's my favourite time of the week. I get to relax, enjoy some light-hearted stories, and let Ellie teach me about fashion too.
That's Saturday Morning Live, every Saturday, 10 till 12.
Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Weekdays on GB News. Wake up to breakfast every day from 6 a.m. Followed by Britain's newsroom at 9:30. At noon, it's Good Afternoon Britain. Followed by Martin Daubney from 3 p.m. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been sending in your mail mogs on crime. Lee says, look at the way the police can come in full force when English riot, and when communities like Hare Hills riot, they run away. The English who take a stand are labelled as far right, and it's completely out of order. I don't agree with any sort of rioting, but people have simply had enough of how this country is going so far downhill that we are at the point of no return. And Stephen said, Stephen's point's really important, actually. We had much worse poverty in the Victorian slums, but we didn't have the same breakdown of law and order that we have today. So, Huw Edwards has pleaded guilty to making indecent images of children. Westminster Magistrates Court was told 7 of the 41 indecent images sent to the veteran broadcaster by a man who has now been named from Merthyr Tydfil were of the most serious type. What I'm interested in is why the liberal media elites, led by the likes of Lewis Goodall, John Sopel and Owen Jones, jumped his defence and blamed The Sun for reporting on earlier allegations about Mr. Edwards. They wanted to shoot the messenger, and without the courage of The Sun, against the background of increasingly restrictive privacy laws, a dangerous predator on children would have remained at large, able to continue enjoying dinner parties with his lefty defenders. Well, I'm joined now by my fearsomely feisty panel, historian broadcaster Tessa Dunlop and the associate commentator at The Telegraph, Mutaz Ahmed. Mutaz, The Sun has done an enormous public service, and it had bile poured all over it by people like Lewis Goodall and so on for daring to report on one of the colossuses of the BBC.
Yes, it was a separate allegation.
Yes.
But it was one of those stories that, without a tabloid newspaper, would never have got out, because it was about, you know, some family somewhere making accusations against the Colossus, a BBC giant. And this is where the tabloid media does its job best. It represents all sorts of voices against the establishment, really. And if every story is treated in the way that the BBC treated Huw Edwards, even after he was arrested, a lot of these people would not be held accountable for their actions.
Well, we can hear, I think, what John Sopel had to say about it when it was happening at the time, which gives you a flavour of where the left were.
We now know there was no illegality. So what are you left with? Someone's private life has come under scrutiny, who is now unwell. I think it would be a crying shame if this is the last we see of Huw Edwards on television, when the allegations have turned out to be not that much.
Crying shame that it was the last we saw of Huw Edwards on television when he was getting paid £400,000 a year.
Well, of course, John Sopel is another colossus who earns a great deal of money post-BBC, talking about institutions like the BBC. I think we can come on to these giants that the corporation creates that have, I think, disproportionate clout in Britain's
public life. But I think we need to clarify, and here I do, to an extent, support John Sopel's error of judgment in that case. We need to clarify that Alex Williams, who was the man who's now been convicted as a paedophile and supplied Huw Edwards with these horrific images, is a separate case, and there is no connection, I believe, between the Sun coming out and talking about these sordid pictures he'd received from some young person and the parents
Yes,
were
but the Sun reveals that there's something very wrong.
Yes,
and that's where these privacy laws are so dangerous, because look at Jimmy Savile, you get these powerful people who every allegation of them is dismissed. Nobody dares report them because they're worried about the libel laws and now privacy laws, and then the police aren't looking out for it. And Huw Edwards is not a particularly uncommon name in Wales.
But the truth is that the police, using Alex Williams' telephone, discovered who he'd sent these horrific images to, and one of the recipients was Huw Edwards, and he would have therefore been arrested in November, irrespective
Do you think so? I wonder if the police would have noticed. If
you think they wouldn't have followed up where these messages went to?
How many others have been prosecuted? We have to see the full picture. Because
so you're saying they went down the list and they said, well, it's all right.
Oh, my goodness, this is Huw Edwards.
No, well, in that case, that's discriminatory policing, and it's totally inappropriate.
No, because you're as jealous. Because they'd have been alert to it. They'd have known, rather than thinking, oh, Huw Edwards...
No, I'm so sorry, Jacob. What you've suggested there is that Mr Nobody on a mobile phone, the police wouldn't bother following up on, but Huw Edwards they followed up on. That's discriminatory policing. I would presume that every paedophile, irrespective of whether they're famous or not, should be caught.
But because they would have noticed that he'd been reported as having these interests, that the Sun had reported about his behaviour, and therefore it was of interest to people, and there were concerns and he'd been investigated already by another police force. And it's like the background checks you do on people, that once somebody has a reputation, inevitably the police are more interested. So I think the Sun did a service in highlighting the earlier allegations.
And the Sun story didn't come out in isolation. We know now from people like Craig Oliver that there were rumours in the BBC about Huw Edwards. It came out in that context. The Sun was just brave enough to report it. Yeah. But the other interesting point is the mental health point, because there's a question about the extent to which this veil of victimhood can protect people. And the BBC knew he was arrested for serious offences, and it kept him on the payroll.
This was disgusting, I agree with you. Here I concur. I was absolutely appalled to discover that man has been given not half sick pay or, a bit of a knockdown because he was off, full pay, the best paid newsreader, £400,000, with an increase, a bump in that pay running up to April. And that's where I've got a real issue with these untouchables that the corporation creates. It's meant to be impartial, but there they go. They stride forward like colossi after they've been released from their BBC stable. And as a freelancer who chips away and speaks occasionally on their channel for 50 quid, it is actually galling when it's eye-wateringly appalling, to be honest. And sometimes, you'd think you'd be forgiven for thinking there's only one person who can talk on history, one who can talk on sport, and only Huw Edwards could do the gold-plated reporting on Prince Philip's funeral the day after, apparently, he'd been looking at sordid pornography. I just find the whole thing revolting, and it needs to be deconstructed in that way.
And the BBC's reputation in all of this, because it did employ Jimmy Savile and Rolf Harris, both of them for a very long time. Both of them were untouchable. Huw Edwards, until the Sun reported about him, seemed also to be untouchable, and they pay him, as Tessa was saying, for months afterwards. The BBC has serious questions to answer.
Yeah, it could be accused of institutional failures once again.
Or favouritism. But, he got paid even more than Jacob Rees-Mogg gets paid on GBNews.
Is it that the BBC hires bad people?
No,
or is it that the BBC creates bad people?
No, I think that's untrue. I think generally most people who work at the BBC, and I've been in there often, are decent folk. He's just extraordinarily high profile because the BBC allowed him to become so.
And Tessa, in some ways, you said it was pornography. It's actually worse than pornography because it's child abuse.
It's horrible.
It's child abuse pictures.
Sorry, that's what I meant. I didn't mean that. I was getting muddling my peas.
You were letting him off.
But I didn't mean to let him off. That was a slip. These are grave and serious images. 377 sexual images, 41 indecent involving young people, and 3 counts where the children are teeny-weeny children, primary school children. It's disgusting.
7 years old.
It's disgusting. It makes you want to vomit in your mouth. But the other thing I just want to say...
I think we're going to have to... I think this is too distasteful for this time in the evening. Okay. But thank you to my panel. In a moment, we'll be looking at how Labour's green energy drive could very soon cost you more than £1 billion.
Hello, good evening. Welcome to your latest GB News weather update brought to you from the Met Office. Increasingly humid overnight with a threat of thunderstorms, but it will remain largely dry across northern areas. Plenty of sunshine to come this evening and through tomorrow here. High pressure still dominating, but it is drifting away to the east, and low pressure will arrive from the south as well as from the west throughout the rest of this week. Now, across the southeast this evening, there's a risk of some heavy downpours, but overnight that risk becomes more widespread, pushing into parts of Wales, northern and central areas of England, as well as sticking around in the southeast as well. And it's going to be a humid night for many areas. Drier and slightly fresher across eastern areas of Scotland, however. Now into tomorrow morning, there's a chance of some very heavy downpours. There's a warning in force for much of Thursday for a large proportion of England and Wales. That could affect anywhere east of Wales, really, across much of England. And that risk brings a potential for some travel disruption, heavy downpours, frequent lightning, and potentially some quite large hail as well. So do keep up to date with the forecast throughout the day on Thursday. Across parts of Scotland, though, particularly eastern Scotland, it should be a dry start, but sunshine will be fairly limited. Should be a bright start across western areas of England and Wales, though, and plenty of sunshine to come across western areas. But once the sun does break out across central and eastern areas of England, there's a further risk of some heavy downpours. Further travel disruption is expected through Thursday. Not everywhere will see these thunderstorms, but where you do see them, they could bring some fairly major impacts. It's going to be another humid day, temperatures in the mid to high 20s once again. On Friday, it looks fairly dry to start the day. There's a risk of some further downpours across eastern areas into the afternoon, but looking further west, there is a change on the way. A weather front wrapped around an area of low pressure will bring fresher, wetter and windier weather as we head into the weekend. So showery weather, particularly across northwestern areas, a little bit drier and brighter across the south and east.
We're proud to be GB News, the People's Channel. And as you know, we always love to hear your views. Now, there's a new way of getting in touch with us at gbnews.com/yoursay. By commenting, you can be part of a live conversation and join our GB News community. You can even talk to me, Bev Turner, or any of the members of the GB News family.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes. Thank you for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
I'm Isabel Webster. Thanks for joining us on GB News, Britain's news channel.
If you want your news to be straight talking... This is a nightmare for the Conservatives again. Down to earth. It's not just Nottingham where this is happening, is it? And most importantly, honest. Hard-working, middle-class taxpayers, they'll get their book thrown at them. Then catch me, Martin Daubney, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6 p.m. on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Well, welcome back. We were talking about Huw Edwards, and the mail mogs have come in, and Robert says the BBC even gave Edwards a pay rise when he was suspended. They must have known that he was guilty. No, that's not quite fair. The licence fee should be cancelled because the BBC is unfit for purpose. So, the government will add up to £1.5 billion to household energy bills as part of an offshore wind farm investment plan, according to calculations by The Telegraph. The Energy Secretary is seeking to build an extra 3,000 to 4,000 giant turbines along Britain's coast and will set aside over £1 billion in order to attract industry providers. Companies are guaranteed a price for the power they generate under the government's Contract for Difference scheme. And this price, according to how the scheme functions, will be paid for, of course, by you, the consumer. Well, I'm joined now by Dan Monzani, UK Managing Director at Aurora Energy Research and former Director of Energy Security at BEIS. Well, welcome. Thank you very much. In my 7 weeks at BEIS, energy security was my greatest concern. I was worried we were going to switch the lights out. But can you explain how these Contract for Difference work and what they offer to investors?
Right. So one of the big challenges with investing in large capital-intensive projects like wind farms is, of course, to reduce the cost of capital in building those things. So what a CFD does is it gives a guaranteed price. If the price in the wholesale market is above that, then the companies have to pay back consumers. And if they're below that guaranteed level, then they receive a top-up. So they get a fixed price for each unit of power they produce.
And so that means that if there are lower cost forms of energy, or indeed if wind energy is being produced when nobody needs it, the wind farm companies still get paid?
Well, that's right. But of course, also they produce power that substitutes for gas or for coal that would have otherwise been there. And those operating costs are avoided by the presence of the wind as well. So it's absolutely right to say, as you do, that the government's planning on adding £1.5 billion of capital expenditure, but it is also going to benefit from offsetting savings from having to use fewer commodities to produce the same power.
Yeah, sort of up to a point, because if you look at the strike prices in the last round, and these are in not inflation-adjusted terms, in the terms of the agreements, £73 per megawatt hour for offshore wind and £176 per megawatt hour for floating offshore wind projects. That was last government's strike prices. And yet the gas price has come back down. Henry Hub is offering gas at $17 per megawatt hour. Now, obviously, that doesn't translate into electricity of $17 per megawatt hour, but it comes to about $35 per megawatt hour, stunningly cheaper than these wind farms.
Well, there's a couple of things there. So one is floating wind is undoubtedly a novel technology that they are attempting to support in the hope that the costs will come down. You can dispute whether that's a sensible industrial strategy, but it is an industrial strategy, I think, more than looking for the absolute lowest form of cheap energy that you can get today. The Henry Hub price, of course, is the gas that's available in the US. You've still got to transport it and re-gasify it in the UK. So gas delivered to our shores is more expensive than in the US. And then about half of that is lost in the conversion process into power. Now, of course, you're right. Just burning gas today is cheaper than wind. But a couple of years ago, wind was a lot cheaper. And I suppose that is the quid pro quo of a fixed price. There are times when it will be above the strike price and times when it will be below it.
But there's only been a very brief period when gas has been more expensive. And that's partly our fault because we haven't done things like fracking to provide our own gas supplies.
So it's definitely right that the price is generally, the strike price is generally above the gas price. Although, of course, when the spikes are very big, we're very grateful for that price. I mean, of course, part of the reason for doing this is to decarbonise, and there are different ways of doing that. However, if you've made the decision to decarbonise, then actually doing it in a way that reduces the costs and actually moves faster to get wind onto the system, avoiding today's gas prices, is actually a cheaper pathway than delaying action.
The problem there, though, is that the government keeps on saying this is going to cost less. And they're sort of selling the electorate, and this was true of the Conservatives when we were in government too, and Labour's doing the same, but perhaps more of it, is that we're pretending this is all going to be cheaper soon. And actually it isn't. It's more expensive for quite a long time than just carrying on using gas, fracking, getting your own gas, and maximising your effort to keep prices low?
So it depends an awful lot on whether you've done the sensible things to integrate this wind into the system. So as you quite rightly said, there will be times when it's windy and there's too much wind to be used, and other times when it's not windy enough. If you have a system that fails to redistribute that power, then yes, it is going to be a very expensive system. If you find ways, for example, using storage, building more in networks and having the right market design to actually make use of the power whenever it's produced and wherever it's produced, then actually you can produce a secure and low-cost system, even with a high level of renewable penetration. Just to say a word on the gap. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, unfortunately, I ought to pass on, but thank you so much for a really clear exposition. I'm very grateful. Thank you.
My pleasure.
I've still got my panel with me, historian and broadcaster Tessa Dunlop and the associate comment editor at The Telegraph, Mutaz Ahmed. Tessa...
Can I just say, listening to that was like listening to A for atheist and B for believer. You're just on two totally different tracks.
I thought he explained it extremely well.
Well, he did, but he just comes from a totally different standpoint from you. You're still stuck in the dinosaur age of fracking and gas, and we just keep on keeping on. The globe's getting hotter, but we keep on keeping on with our carbon. And he believes in the Green Revolution.
In 2000, when the UK had the lowest energy prices pretty much across Europe, we were fifth largest manufacturing country in the world.
Right.
Now our prices are the second highest in the world. We've collapsed to 12th. So you destroy industry because you don't care about the price of energy. It's a disastrous policy that is putting people out of work.
That is a really nifty little shortcut you've done there. There's a huge number of variables that have changed.
But energy
since
price
the
is
turn
one
of
of the
21st
fundamental
century.
ones.
Yeah, and so is the shrinkage of our international market by falling out of love with Europe and Brexit.
That hasn't made any difference to our manufacturing industry.
Well, and likewise, I could just say glibly, it hasn't made any difference to the cost of our energy price. I would like to point out that if you were going to drill a new gas field resource, and that is actually more expensive than these offshore wind farms. And what's a big question to me is
why then doesn't it need any subsidy? If you drill a new gas field, the government doesn't give you any subsidy, doesn't give you a guaranteed price. You get the market price. You take the market risk.
But we know that because it's a technology it's disastrous for global warming. So the government can't subsidise it. But just really quickly, the Crown Estate made a profit of £1.1 billion last year because of wind farms. Why can't that go directly to funding Ed Miliband's £1.5 billion black hole?
That all comes back into the state, other than the small amount that goes to rebuild Buckingham Palace. Mutaz, if we want any industry, we need cheap energy. And we are running a policy that is putting the UK out of business.
Exactly. And there is no global warming exemption in the Labour manifesto, which said it would reduce energy prices. Energy prices will probably rise as a result of this. But you have to be a real sort of green fanatic, like Ed Miliband, to look at the...
He eats tofu. I think he's a full-time vegetarian.
He's mad. Look at the offshore wind.
He's a very, very charming man.
He is. I'm talking about his politics.
I was talking about his diet.
to look at the offshore wind industry, which is in crisis everywhere, including in the US, where some states are offering $98 per megawatt hour, and think that's an area where we should invest taxpayer money. And the fact is that an industry that requires such huge subsidies just to stay alive probably shouldn't be alive.
It's just...
And the world isn't ending, is it?
No.
You know, we've had a hot day today, but the world seems to be surviving this modest rise in temperature that we've had.
And a bit of heat is not bad news for the UK.
That's so disingenuous, Jake. It really upsets me because I like you personally. When you say bonkers stuff like that, when actually the globe is creaking, we have these extreme weather events that are attacking every continent.
This is the fanaticism. We're 1% of emissions, we make no difference. But actually more people are killed every year. More people are killed every year from cold than from heat. You know that to be true.
Jacob,
slightly warmer
I want
planet
to point out,
is not a complete disaster.
We are so well equipped to lead the inevitable green revolution. Jump on board. Come with me, my friend.
We also benefit from slightly higher temperatures. The UK, but that's...
No, we don't. We've just had a downpour summer because of global warming. But it just takes a sophisticated brain to work out how much more rain is because of global warming. I can explain to you off air.
Great.
Well, we look forward with bated breath to that wonderful explanation, which I will bring back to viewers next week if it makes any sense at all. So don't hold your breath. Thank you to my panel. Up next, we'll be looking at the state of sick note Britain amidst the news that we are facing a productivity crisis costing the economy £30 billion.
GB News Breakfast, every day from 6 a.m.
Did you ever flirt with the idea of going to America?
Yeah, I've twice happened to be. Once I was offered in Canada the job of a weatherman.
Oh.
Yeah, I was offered that, and I just sort of thought of it. What is the point where your mother, your father would never see you on TV? What's the point of doing it if nobody knows you on it? You know. So I thought
big money though, even for a weatherman.
I did. Yeah, it was more than a weather job, but I said no basically. And then I went and I did this quiz show for Fox TV.
Oh.
Yeah, and they said, we want the Irish guy that does the lottery. I think they meant Dermot O'Leary or something. They ended up, they got me and I couldn't believe it. And I went over to do a daytime version of this. And then 3 days into it, they changed everything and they said, this is so good, we're putting this out in the evening. And I remember phoning my wife and saying, we're going to have to move out to California.
Oh, wow.
They really want me here and I'm going down. You know that street with all the palm trees and whatever? That's the way I was going to work, in this limo and whatever. And I had a bungalow there and a golf cart. It was absolutely incredible. Anyway, I'll cut this very long story short. So I'm working really, really bad. A lot of very ignorant people, it has to be said. And really have one regret in my life that I didn't didn't punch a guy when I was out there. I really would have, if I had my life to live again, I would have really satisfiedly been sacked for punching this git. But basically, anyway, they put the show out. One episode of the show went out and it came fourth in its rating. So it was behind Lost, it was behind The Biggest Loser, there was something else there.
Fair enough.
Fair enough, and it came fourth, and that was it. It disappeared. 36 shows or so disappeared. Disappeared, never to be shown again.
GB News, the People's Channel.
I'm Patrick Christie's. Every weeknight from 9, I bring you 2 hours of unmissable, explosive debate and headline-grabbing interviews. What impact has that had?
We got death threats and the bomb threat and so on.
As time passes, she could have said stump. You made my argument for me.
My guests and I tackle the issues that really matter with a sharp take on every story.
It went everywhere. Something practical could be done.
Or I can become something different. Patrick Christie's tonight from 9 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Tune in to Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. GB News royalty with your perfect start to the weekend. Lucky us. Feisty and fearless guests.
Well, I'm a normal person, so ask me.
Honest opinions that raises more questions than a Gary Barlow tax return. And a few surprises along the way.
Might be cold in this studio.
That is Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan. 8 to 9 only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Well, welcome back. We were talking about Labour's green energy drive, and Colin says surely upgrading the national grid must be the priority before expanding the supply of renewables. And Nigel, if Ofgem is allowing energy companies to charge up the shortfall of those that cannot pay, to charge extra of those who can pay by upping the standing charge to keep their profits, the whole thing is a big con. End of story. Well, that, I think, is a very fair point, that we shouldn't allow people to pay charges for those who can't pay. The electricity companies should collect money from those who owe it. 6 days, sick days, have nearly doubled since 2018, costing companies an extra £30 billion a year. New analysis by the Institute for Public Policy Research, the famous think tank, has shown that workers are reporting unwell on an average of 6.7 days a year, up from 3.7 days 6 years ago. Is there a new plague of minor afflictions crisscrossing the land, or did we become too accustomed to the sofa during the pandemic? Well, to discuss the IPPR's findings, I'm joined now by Dr. Jamie O'Halloran, a senior research fellow at the think tank. Jamie, thank you very much for coming in.
Likewise, thank you for having me.
It's not quite doubling, but why are people feeling the need to take almost double the numbers of days off in 2023 than they did in 2018?
Yeah, so there's an interesting point. So we are becoming a slightly sort of unhealthier sort of nation. We're seeing growing rates of obesity. We're seeing us lagging behind in parental and avoidable mortality. But the real problem we're facing actually isn't people going to work while sick. It's actually people going to work whilst they're ill. And this is actually costing businesses and the economy and sort of workers more money. So it's not a sickness problem, it's a sort of health problem that businesses are suffering with.
And are there greater problems, because I have seen figures previously, in the public sector than in the private sector? There seem to be more days off sick in the public sector.
So our analysis doesn't sort of break down by public or private sector, but like one point that I could do want to sort of make as well is that our sick days compared to other countries in Europe is far less, is far below. For example, Germany, for example, is a country that has, on average, the workers take 20 days off, whereas we're taking 6 days off per year. This sort of shows that it's not necessarily sick days is the problem, it's a general health problem that is causing these
So what are the health issues? Because there are some very concerning figures on health and life expectancy in different parts of the country and on different income distributions. Yeah. Is this something you're seeing reflected in sickness amongst the labour force?
So again, we're unable to in this sort of analysis we're unable to break down by income. But what we do find is that those on the lowest incomes are less likely to have access to sick pay. So if you're in the lowest quintile, you're twice as less likely to have sick pay. And sick pay itself isn't necessarily quite a bad policy at the moment, because it's £117 per week. So if you're a full-time worker, you're earning £3.20 per hour, and that's what needs to change. We need to sort of support people to go from sickness into work. That's going to boost productivity in the UK and then be good for businesses.
Because your concern is productivity and the £30 billion a year of productivity that's lost. And we've got a long-standing productivity problem going back really to the early 1990s. And do I understand your argument correctly that what you need to do is to have a healthier country, and then if people are going into work well, they will be more productive, rather than we're losing productivity because all these idlers aren't going into work?
Indeed. So we've seen a stagnation of productivity predominantly since the financial crisis in 2008. It's been unbelievably stagnant. And the only reason why we've seen economic growth actually in the UK is increasing labour supplies, people working longer hours, or there's more people working. And what we believe is that by creating a sort of healthier country, we're going to sort of achieve these productivity gains that otherwise we wouldn't be facing.
And what are your policies to make people healthier, and how do you balance this by allowing people freedom of choice?
So totally. So we in our report, I won't list all the policies we have in the report. It's quite a long, heavy report, but it's a business-backed plan. It's a cross-party sort of commission, and we have a number of policies. So the main aim that we want there are two main facets of it. So we want to support businesses that promote health. So we want to see businesses improve their job quality. So particularly around SMEs, we want to give additional support to SMEs to improve job quality. But then also the second point of that, we want to one of our ideas is that businesses profit should be from solving the world's problems, not by causing them. So in that premise, we want to reduce the harm that we are sort of facing and fix the market failures that we exist. So don't give advertising to children shouldn't be the case. Making the internet a safer place.
And what about mental health as opposed to physical health? Because in terms of obesity, you can put sugar taxes on. I'm not necessarily in favour of them, but you can do things like that. How do you help improve people's mental health?
I think it's really challenging, and it's quite a great affliction into the UK. I think there's some really good research done by the Health Foundation, which showed that there's growing numbers of people from working age who are going to be diagnosed with anxiety and depression. I think the real part of it is we want to improve job quality. We know that sort of bad jobs are really bad for mental health, and that then leads into sort of more additional health problems.
But not being in work is probably even worse for mental health than...
Actually, recent evidence finds that actually being out of work is better for your health than being in really bad work.
How do you find bad work? I'm very interested in that, because how do you find really bad work?
I don't remember the full facts of the study, but it's like low pay, low autonomy, inflexibility, these sort of characteristics.
And of the rise from 3.7 days to 6.7 days, how much of that is mental health, or have you not broken that down?
Again, this is information that we don't necessarily have, but yes, it has increased, but it is important to know that the biggest thing is actually people going to
work when they're
sick.
When they're not very well, which they were told not to do during COVID, but they've gone back to doing...
Well, it could be part for many reasons. Potentially, you could say working from home enables you to work more when you're sort of sick, potentially, is one potential argument. But this is an area we haven't necessarily investigated, per se.
Well, thank you so much, Jamie. It's a really interesting area, and I think one we will come back to. Up next, it's Mark Dolan of Patrick Christie's. Mark, what have you got on the bill of fare this evening?
Well, Jacob, the riots in Southport last night were a disgrace, but public anger about Britain's parallel societies must be addressed, a point that you made very excellently earlier. Not satisfied with offending 2.6 billion Christians, the most woke Olympics ever strike again, Jacob, with two biological males facing female competitors in the boxing ring. At what point is a woman going to die? Plus reaction to the BBC's Huw Edwards pleading guilty to child pornography charges. It's a story that I wasn't afraid to tackle this time last year. I'll be reacting at 10.
Well, the story about the mailboxes is absolutely peculiar. Of all the trans issues, this seems to me to be the most bonkers. Anyway, that's all coming up after the weather. I will be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. For now, I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation, and I hear the weather in Somerset will be very good and that there's been an excellent cricket match going on in Blagdon, where Peter did very well.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello, good evening. Welcome to your latest GB News weather update brought to you from the Met Office. Increasingly humid overnight with a threat of thunderstorms, but it will remain largely dry across northern areas. Plenty of sunshine to come this evening and through tomorrow here. High pressure still dominating, but it is drifting away to the east, and low pressure will arrive from the south as well as from the west throughout the rest